There comes a moment in a woman's life when the noise fades, when the people she thought would stay walk away, when the doors she prayed would open remain shut, and she finds herself standing in a place she never planned to be, a place called alone. Not the kind of alone where your phone is silent, but the kind of alone where your heart is heavy, where your prayers feel like they're hitting the ceiling, and your tears become your only language. It's in that space where God begins to do his most intentional work. Because sometimes God will remove the people you leaned on so you can discover the power you carry. Sometimes he'll allow the rejection so you can be redirected. Sometimes he'll strip away every distraction just to remind you, I am still enough. And I don't know who I came to speak to today, but there's a woman under the sound of my voice who feels like she's lost everything, who feels like she's been forgotten, who feels like she's carrying more than she can bear. But can I tell you something? When a woman has no one but God, she's not at her weakest, she's at the edge of her transformation. Because when God is all you have, you finally realize God is all you ever needed. So if you've been crying, if you've been questioning, if you've been wondering, God, where are you? I came to remind you today, he didn't leave you. He cleared the room so you could hear him. And when you learn how to stand with God alone, that's when everything changes. Isolation is not punishment. It's divine preparation. There are seasons in life when everything around you grows quiet, when the people you expected to stand beside you slowly disappear, when the support you once depended on is no longer available, and it can feel like you're being singled out, forgotten, or even rejected. In those moments, it's easy to misinterpret what's happening. It's easy to assume that you've done something wrong, that you're being punished, or that you've somehow fallen out of favor. But what if the very thing that feels like rejection is actually divine redirection? What if the silence is an abandonment, but an invitation to hear God more clearly than ever before? Isolation has a way of stripping away the noise that once distracted you. When everything and everyone is present, it's easy to lean on familiar voices, to seek validation from people, to find comfort in places that were never meant to sustain you. But when God begins to prepare you for something greater, he often removes those external supports, not to harm you, but to reposition you. Because there are some levels of growth, some depths of purpose that cannot be reached while you are surrounded by constant noise and dependence on others. There is a difference between being alone and being abandoned. Being alone can be a sacred space where transformation begins, where your identity is no longer shaped by opinions, expectations, or comparisons, but by the truth of who God says you are. In isolation, you are confronted with yourself, your fears, your insecurities, your doubts, but also your strength, your resilience, and your untapped potential. It is in that quiet place that God begins to rebuild you from the inside out. Sometimes, God will intentionally allow you to walk through seasons where you don't have anyone to lean on, not because he wants you to suffer, but because he knows what you are capable of becoming. If you always had someone to rescue you, you would never discover the strength he placed within you. If you always had someone to affirm you, you might never learn how to hear his voice above all others. Isolation teaches you how to depend on God in a way that comfort never could. In those moments when you feel like you've been left to figure it all out on your own, God is actually drawing you closer. He is inviting you into a deeper relationship, one that is not based on convenience or circumstance, but on trust. Because real faith is not developed when everything is going well, when you are surrounded by support and encouragement. Real faith is built in the quiet, in the uncertainty, in the moments when you have no choice but to rely on him completely. Isolation also exposes what has been hidden beneath the surface. It reveals where you have placed your identity, what you have depended on for validation, and where you have been seeking approval. It can be uncomfortable, even painful, to face those truths, but it is necessary for growth, because you cannot step into the fullness of who you are meant to be while carrying false identities or relying on temporary sources of worth. God uses isolation to refine you, to remove what no longer serves you, and to prepare you for what is ahead. There are things God wants to show you that can only be revealed in private. There are lessons that can only be learned when you are no longer distracted. There is a level of clarity that can only come when everything else has been stripped away. What feels like loss is often the beginning of revelation. What feels like emptiness is often the space God is preparing to fill with something greater. And while it may not feel like it in the moment, isolation is not a sign that God has left you behind. It is often a sign that He is setting you apart. There is a difference between being left out and being set apart. Being left out suggests rejection, but being set apart indicates purpose. It means that God is doing something in you that requires your full attention, your full surrender, your full presence. The process may not be comfortable. There will be moments when you question, when you wonder why things had to change, why certain people had to leave, why certain doors had to close. But preparation rarely feels pleasant. Growth often requires discomfort. Transformation demands that you let go of what is familiar so that you can embrace what is necessary. In isolation, you begin to discover a different kind of strength, the kind that is not dependent on external circumstances, but rooted in something deeper. You begin to realize that even when everything else is gone, you are still standing. Even when no one else shows up, God remains constant. Even when you feel unseen, you are still known. And in that realization, something begins to shift inside of you, because the same place that once felt empty becomes the very place where you are filled. The same silence that once felt heavy becomes the space where you hear God more clearly. The same isolation that once felt like punishment becomes the ground where your purpose begins to take shape. God removes people to reveal your true identity. There are moments in life when relationships shift without warning, when people you once leaned on begin to fade, when connections you believed were permanent suddenly become distant, and it can leave you questioning everything. You start asking, what did I do wrong? Why did they leave? Why does it feel like everyone is disappearing at the same time? And in the middle of that confusion, it's easy to believe that the loss of people is a reflection of your worth. It's easy to internalize their absence as evidence that you are not enough, that you have somehow failed, that you are being rejected. But sometimes what feels like rejection is actually revelation, because as long as certain people remain in your life, it can be difficult to see yourself clearly. Their opinions, their expectations, their perceptions can become mirrors that distort your identity. You start to define yourself based on how they see you, based on what they affirm, based on what they criticize. You begin to shrink or stretch to fit into roles that were never meant for you, trying to maintain connections that require you to compromise who you are. There are relationships that unintentionally place limits on your growth. Not because those people are necessarily bad, but because they are familiar. They are used to a version of you that God is trying to evolve. And when you begin to change, when you begin to grow, when you start stepping into something deeper, not everyone will recognize you. Not everyone will understand you. Some will try to pull you back into the version of yourself they are comfortable with because your growth challenges their expectations. So God, in His wisdom, will sometimes remove people not to hurt you, but to free you. Because you cannot fully become who you are meant to be while you are still trying to maintain who you used to be for someone else. You cannot walk in your true identity while constantly seeking approval from those who only knew your past. There are seasons where God has to separate you from certain voices so that you can hear His voice clearly. When people leave, it exposes where you have been placing your identity. If your sense of worth was tied to their presence, their affirmation, their approval, then their absence will feel like a loss of self. But that is exactly where the revelation begins. Because your identity was never meant to be rooted in people. It was never meant to depend on how others see you, how they treat you, or whether they choose to stay. Your identity is something deeper, something unchanging, something that cannot be taken away by human decisions. There is a version of you that exists beyond relationships, beyond roles, beyond expectations. A version of you that is not defined by being someone's friend, someone's partner, someone's support system, but by who God created you to be at your core. And sometimes, the only way for you to discover that version is to be separated from everything that has been defining you. It can feel uncomfortable, even painful, to no longer have the same people in your life. There is a sense of loss, a sense of emptiness, a longing for what used to be. But in that space, something powerful begins to happen. Without the constant influence of others, you begin to hear your own thoughts more clearly. You begin to recognize your own desires, your own passions, your own convictions. You begin to ask yourself who you are without the expectations of others shaping your choices. And that is where true identity is formed. Not in the noise of many voices, but in the quiet where you are forced to confront who you really are. It is in that space that God begins to show you things about yourself that you never noticed before. Strengths you didn't realize you had, dreams you had buried, purpose that had been overshadowed by the need to belong. When God removes people, He is not leaving you empty. He is making room for clarity. He is clearing away the confusion so that you can see yourself through His perspective instead of through the lens of others. Because as long as you are looking at yourself through someone else's eyes, you will always have a limited view. But when you begin to see yourself the way God sees you, everything changes. You start to realize that you are not who they said you were. You are not confined to the roles they assigned you. You are not limited by their understanding of you. There is more to you than what they experienced, more to you than what they acknowledged, more to you than what they could handle. And the removal of certain people is often what reveals that truth. It is not always easy to accept. There will be moments when you miss them, when you question whether things could have been different, when you wonder if you could have done something to make them stay. But not everyone is meant to walk with you into every season of your life. Some people are only assigned to a chapter, not the entire story. And holding on to those who are not meant for your next season can prevent you from stepping fully into who you are becoming. God's removal is often His protection. Protection from staying in environments that limit you, from remaining connected to identities that no longer fit, from being defined by perspectives that are too small for where you are going. It may not feel like protection in the moment, but in time, you begin to see that what was removed was not meant to sustain you. And in the absence of those voices, you begin to hear a different voice. A voice that speaks truth instead of limitation, a voice that calls out purpose instead of doubt, a voice that reminds you of who you are beyond every label you have carried. And as you begin to align with that voice, your identity starts to take shape in a way that is not dependent on anyone else. Because when God removes people, He is not taking away your value, He is revealing it. Your breaking point is the birthplace of your transformation. There comes a moment in every woman's life when the weight becomes too much, when the pressure builds to a place that feels unbearable, when the strength she has relied on for so long begins to give way. It is that moment when she says, "I can't do this anymore." When the tears fall without warning, when the prayers feel desperate instead of disciplined, it is the moment she never planned for, the moment she tried to avoid, the moment that feels like everything is falling apart at once. That breaking point can feel like failure. It can feel like weakness, like something inside of you has given up. You look at yourself and wonder how you got here, how you became so overwhelmed, how the life you tried so hard to hold together is now slipping through your hands. You might even feel ashamed, as if reaching that point means you weren't strong enough, as if it proves that you couldn't handle what was placed on your shoulders. But what if your breaking point is not the end of your strength, but the beginning of a different kind of strength? What if it is not evidence that you are failing, but an indication that something within you is ready to change? Because the truth is, transformation rarely begins in comfort. It rarely begins when everything is stable, predictable, and under control. Transformation is often born in the moments when the old way of being can no longer sustain you, when the patterns you relied on stop working, when the version of you that got you this far cannot take you any further. A breaking point is not just about what is happening around you, it is about what is happening within you. It is the moment when everything that has been suppressed, ignored, or pushed aside begins to surface. The pain you tried to carry quietly, the expectations you placed on yourself, the roles you took on to keep everything together, all of it begins to collide at once. And while it may feel chaotic, it is also clarifying, because it forces you to acknowledge what is no longer working. There are things you can only see when you reach that point. You begin to recognize the areas where you have been overextending yourself, the places where you have been pouring into others without being filled yourself, the ways you have been trying to control outcomes that were never yours to control. You start to see the imbalance, the exhaustion, the unsustainable pace you have been living. And that awareness, as uncomfortable as it is, becomes the first step toward change. Breaking points strip away illusions. They remove the masks you have been wearing, the strength you have been performing, the image you have been trying to maintain. In that moment, there is no pretending, no hiding, no denying. You are confronted with your reality in its rawest form. And while that can feel overwhelming, it is also where truth begins. Because you cannot transform what you refuse to face. It is often in the breaking that you finally release what you have been holding on to. The expectations you placed on yourself to be everything for everyone, the need to have everything under control, the belief that you have to figure it all out on your own. When you reach your limit, you realize that you were never meant to carry it all. You realize that the strength you have been relying on has its limits, and that there is another source of strength you have not fully tapped into. That is where transformation begins, not in your ability to hold it all together, but in your willingness to let go. Let go of the pressure to be perfect. Let go of the need to have all the answers. Let go of the version of yourself that has been operating in survival mode. Because as long as you are trying to maintain that version, you cannot step into something new. Your breaking point creates space. Space for new perspectives, new priorities, new ways of thinking and being. It disrupts the patterns that kept you stuck, forcing you to reevaluate what truly matters. It pushes you to make decisions you may have been avoiding, to set boundaries you were afraid to establish, to walk away from situations that no longer align with who you are becoming. It is also the place where dependence shifts. When you can no longer rely solely on your own strength, you begin to seek something deeper. You begin to lean into God in a way that is not casual or routine, but necessary. It is no longer about checking a box or saying a prayer out of habit. It becomes a lifeline. In your breaking, you become more open, more honest, more vulnerable. You come to God without pretense, without filters, without trying to have it all together. And in that place of vulnerability, something begins to change. You start to experience a different kind of strength, not one that comes from pushing through or pretending, but one that comes from surrender. A strength that is not about having all the answers, but about trusting even when you don't understand. A strength that allows you to stand, not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer standing alone. The breaking also reshapes your identity. It challenges the way you see yourself, the way you define your worth, the way you measure your success. It moves you away from performance and into authenticity, away from proving and into becoming. You begin to understand that your value is not in how much you can carry, how much you can fix, or how well you can hold everything together. There is a new version of you that begins to emerge from that place, a version that is more aware, more grounded, more aligned. A version that is not driven by pressure, but by purpose. A version that understands her limits and honors them, that recognizes her need for God and embraces it, that is no longer afraid to let go of what is not meant to stay. Because sometimes it is only when you reach your breaking point that you finally break free. When God is all you have, you discover He is more than enough. There are seasons in life when everything you once depended on begins to fall away, when the people you leaned on are no longer present, when the resources you trusted run dry, when the plans you carefully built start to unravel. It is in those moments that you are left with a question you cannot avoid: what remains when everything else is gone? And for many, that realization can feel terrifying, because as long as there were options, as long as there were alternatives, as long as there were people and plans to fall back on, you never had to fully confront what it means to rely on God alone. When everything else is stripped away, you are brought face to face with the depth of your dependence. You begin to see how much of your security was tied to things that could change, to people who could leave, to situations that were never guaranteed. And when those things are no longer there, it can feel like the ground beneath you has shifted. It can feel unstable, uncertain, even overwhelming. Because now you are standing in a place where there is nothing else to lean on but God. At first, that place can feel uncomfortable. You may find yourself reaching for what used to comfort you, searching for familiar solutions, trying to recreate the stability you once had. You may feel the urge to fill the silence, to replace what was lost, to regain control. But as you remain in that space, something begins to shift. You begin to realize that what you thought you needed may not have been sustaining you the way you believed. Because when God becomes your only source, you start to experience Him in ways you never did before. Not as a distant presence, not as a last resort, but as your daily provision, your constant support, your steady foundation. You begin to understand that He is not limited by the absence of what you lost. In fact, it is often in that absence that His presence becomes most evident. You start to notice the ways He sustains you, even when you don't have what you thought you needed. Strength shows up when you feel weak. Peace settles in moments that should be overwhelming. Clarity comes in situations that once felt confusing. Doors open in places you didn't expect. And slowly, you begin to see that what you lost did not leave you empty. It created space for something greater. There is a difference between knowing that God is enough and experiencing that He is enough. It is one thing to say it when everything is going well, when you still have other sources of support. But it is another thing entirely to live it, to walk through days where He is truly all you have, and to discover that you are still sustained, still guided, still held together. That kind of understanding cannot be taught from a distance. It has to be lived. When God is all you have, your relationship with Him deepens. It moves beyond routine, beyond obligation, beyond surface-level connection. It becomes real, personal, necessary. You begin to talk to Him differently, to seek Him more intentionally, to listen more closely. You become more aware of His presence in your daily life, more attuned to His guidance, more sensitive to His voice. You also begin to let go of control. When you don't have multiple options, when you can't rely on your own plans or the support of others, you are forced to trust in a way that is deeper than before. You learn to take steps without having all the answers, to move forward without seeing the full picture, to believe even when you don't understand. And in that process, your faith is strengthened, not because everything becomes easy, but because you learn to trust in the midst of uncertainty. There is a freedom that comes with that kind of dependence. The pressure to have everything figured out begins to lift. The need to control every outcome begins to fade. You realize that you are not responsible for carrying everything on your own. You begin to rest in the understanding that God is not only present, but active, working in ways you cannot always see. When God is all you have, your perspective shifts. What once felt like loss begins to look like alignment. What once felt like emptiness begins to feel like space for growth. What once felt like isolation begins to feel like intimacy. You start to see that the removal of other sources was not meant to weaken you, but to strengthen your connection with Him. You also begin to understand that God's sufficiency is not dependent on your circumstances. He does not need everything to be perfect in order to provide peace. He does not require every door to be open in order to make a way. He is not limited by what is missing in your life. His ability to sustain you goes beyond what you can see, beyond what you can measure, beyond what you can understand. And as you continue in that space, your confidence begins to grow. Not confidence in your own ability to control everything, but confidence in God's ability to carry you through anything. You begin to realize that if you can stand in a season where He is all you have and still find strength, still find peace, still find direction, then there is nothing you cannot face with Him. You start to recognize that what you thought you needed was never your source. The people, the plans, the resources, they were never the foundation. They were additions, temporary supports, but not the source of your strength. And when those things are removed, you are left with the only source that has been constant all along. Because when everything else fades, God remains unchanged. When everything else is uncertain, He is steady. When everything else is limited, He is limitless. And in discovering that, you come to understand that having God is not settling for less. It is stepping into more than you ever realized was possible. Standing alone with God produces unshakable strength. There is a kind of strength that comes from being surrounded by people, from having support, encouragement, and affirmation constantly flowing into your life. That strength feels reassuring. It feels safe. It feels secure. But there is another kind of strength that is formed in a very different way. A strength that is not built on who is standing with you, but on who you are standing with. A strength that does not depend on applause, agreement, or validation, but is rooted in something deeper, something unmovable. Standing alone is not something most people desire. It challenges your sense of security. It exposes your fears. It forces you to confront parts of yourself you might have avoided. When you no longer have the comfort of familiar voices guiding you, affirming you, or even distracting you, you are left with a silence that can feel overwhelming. In that silence, your thoughts become louder, your doubts become clearer, and your insecurities may try to take center stage. At first, standing alone can feel like vulnerability. It can feel like you are exposed, like you are carrying more than you should, like you are navigating without direction. But when you stand alone with God, you begin to realize that you are not as alone as you thought, because His presence fills the space where everything else has been removed. What once felt empty becomes occupied by something far greater than any human support could offer. There is a difference between standing alone by yourself and standing alone with God. Standing alone by yourself can lead to isolation, fear, and uncertainty. But standing alone with God brings clarity, confidence, and peace. It is not the absence of people that defines your strength, but the presence of God within that space. Because when He is with you, you are not lacking anything essential. This kind of strength is not developed overnight. It is formed through experience, through moments where you have to make decisions without external validation, where you have to trust what you sense God is leading you to do. Even when it doesn't make sense to others, it is built in the quiet moments where no one sees your struggle, where no one hears your prayers, where no one is there to reassure you, and yet you continue to stand. Standing alone with God teaches you how to trust yourself in a different way. not in your own limited understanding, but in the awareness that God is guiding you, that His wisdom is available to you, that His presence is with you even when you cannot see the full picture. You begin to rely less on what others think and more on what you know God has placed within you. It also strengthens your convictions. When you are constantly surrounded by opinions, it is easy to become influenced, to second guess yourself, to adjust your direction based on what others say. But when you learn to stand alone with God, you become more grounded. You are no longer easily swayed by every voice, every opinion, every expectation. You develop a steadiness that comes from knowing where you stand and why you stand there. There will be moments when standing alone requires courage. Moments when you have to choose what is right over what is popular, when you have to walk a path that others do not understand, when you have to say no to things that would be easier to accept. In those moments, the strength you have developed becomes evident, because you are no longer making decisions based on comfort or approval, but on conviction. Standing alone with God also teaches you resilience. There will be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. There will be times when you question whether you are on the right path, when you feel the weight of being the only one who understands what you are walking through. But in those moments, you learn how to endure, not by relying on your own strength, but by drawing from a source that does not run out. You begin to understand that strength is not about never feeling weak. It is about knowing where to go when you do feel weak. It is about recognizing that you do not have to have all the answers, that you do not have to have everything figured out, that you can stand even when you feel uncertain because you are not standing on your own. There is also a confidence that grows in this process, not a confidence that is based on pride or self-sufficiency, but a quiet confidence that comes from experience. The more you stand with God, the more you see Him sustain you, guide you, and carry you through situations you did not think you could handle. And with each experience, your trust deepens, your faith becomes more solid, your foundation becomes more secure. This kind of strength is not easily shaken. It is not dependent on circumstances going your way, on people agreeing with you, or on everything being stable. It is a strength that remains even when things are uncertain, even when the path is unclear, even when you are walking through unfamiliar territory, because it is not built on what is around you, but on what is within you. When you stand alone with God, you are no longer defined by who is with you or who is not. Your identity is no longer tied to the presence or absence of people. Your worth is no longer determined by how many support you or how many understand you. You become secure in a way that does not shift with circumstances, because your foundation is not temporary. And as that strength grows, you begin to walk differently. You are less afraid of being misunderstood, less concerned with fitting in, less dependent on approval. You move with a sense of purpose, with a clarity that does not require constant confirmation. You become anchored steady and grounded in a way that cannot be easily moved. Because when you have learned how to stand alone with God, you have learned how to stand through anything. If this message blessed you, don't forget to subscribe, and share it with someone who needs encouragement.